We'll move on to the next part, second part of this evening, where we'll have an interesting panel discussion, where we'll be discussing findings of the report. I would first request Ms. Lata Venkatesh to join us on the stage. She's going to moderate this panel discussion. I think Lata doesn't need introduction. I don't think we can watch TV without watching you, ma'am. No, we look forward to it always. So Lata Venkatesh is Executive Director, CNBC TV 18. She began her career in CNBC TV 18 as the Chief of the Mumbai News Bureau. Over the years, she has come to be recognized as one of the keenest watchers of the Reserve Bank of India, underlined, and a respected commentator on banking sector issues, money markets, and macroeconomic trends. She's been a business journalist for over 20 years and has specialized in covering all markets, stocks, currency, debt, and commodities. She has also had stints in all major streams of media, having worked in the Economic Times and the Dow Jones Newswires for 5 years each. Lata graduated in economics and politics and has a doctoral degree in political science. Next on stage, I would like to invite Mr. Ramesh Damani, who has already been introduced as the chairman of Avenue Supermarts. Mr. Ramesh Damani is a member of the Bombay Stock Exchange and is one of the well-known faces of the stockbroking community in India. He has been a broker for over 20 years. He has done his bachelor's degree in commerce from HR College in Mumbai and has a master's degree in business administration from California State University, Northridge. Today, he is a well-known host of the TV show on CNBC TV 18 and is a frequent commentator on financial issues on CNBC and NDTV. He also hosts a weekly chat show on moneycontrol.com. Finally, I would now like to invite Mr. Akash Prakash. We all know him as one of the foremost foreign institutional investors into India, and I'm sure all of you look forward to his very enlightening articles in the Business Standard. He's known to simplify the most complicated of concepts. Akash is Chief Executive Officer of Amansa Capital Private Limited, with extensive experience spanning over 25 years in Indian securities markets. Akash leads the investment team and directs the process when determining the investment ideas for inclusion in the portfolio. He also manages the overall market risk and acts as Chief Investment Officer for Amansa Fund's investment portfolio. So thank you very much for joining us. I will now hand over to Lata and to Mr. Damani, who are going to jointly moderate this discussion.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay. We just have to wait for a television signal. Okay. Thank you very much. We are meeting between Dussehra and Diwali. We Tams, during Navratri, worship Goddess Saraswati. And during Diwali, of course, we worship Lakshmi. So today we are going to worship Goddess Saraswati so that she helps us earn Lakshmi. We are going to study the science of investing, as it were. Let me put some ground rules here. The easy questions come from the student. You two PhD scholars will be getting the tough questions from your PhD teacher, as it were. So the easy questions first. But actually, I should say first the journalist's question. Akash, you know, okay, before I come to Akash, Ramdev, you know, you made this very exhaustive study that at the moment, the Sensex P is at 21, whereas the average has been 17 for the past 20 years. And for all shares PE, we are at 30, and the average is 16. I mean, this is making it sound a little scary. Are you saying that we have a long, soft period ahead? Soft period ahead for shares. I mean, you won't be buying, or you shouldn't be buying for a very long time. There is another mic for you.
Yeah. So that's what we are saying. But a lot of things can change in the sense that there could be earnings explosion because we have not had earnings for a very long time. Actually, between 14 to 18, literally it's a complete drought of earnings. And now I think the moment I see the L&T results and many other results, I think economy is just about to it looks that it is taking off, 45% growth in the capex build-up and all. So we could be at the doorstep of cusp of earnings explosion. That can change a lot. And then some more factors like, say, oil. If oil tumbles by $10, $15, I mean, that's a wish. It's not that easy to that to happen, but that can happen very quickly. So few things can, basically, the mood can change, or there is some, because we are in the election season, if there could be a complete upset. I mean, all three states, they win. The ruling party wins by huge margin. All positive. So those kind of things can again bring a new wave of optimism. Because right now it's a hope. In the hope, people are thinking that, because there's no earning support. Either earnings come or the hope continues. Or finally there is a disappointment. There are only three scenarios.
Oh, yes, sir. But Akash, the same question to you before the difficult questions come. The easy question. Does it look like we still have to get cheaper before we get attractive?
I mean, I think I would echo what Ramdev was saying, which is that the perennial disappointment in the last 5 years for India has been earnings growth, in the sense that I think, as he showed in the chart himself, you've had like 3-4% earnings growth last 5 years.
This time, we've got a very good number from L&T, Cummins.
But still, the
capital goods numbers.
Yeah,
so,
but still, capital goods
are
are
we in the cusp?
not big enough. But so I would just say that I think the phase of PE expansion, as Ramdev has shown, is over for India. The PEs have expanded to a level where I don't think they can go up any further. Especially not in a world where liquidity is tightening, interest rates are going up. So I think the reality is the bet on India from here is a bet on earnings growth, plain and simple. If earnings growth don't come, the market's going down. I mean, plain and simple.
Is it looking like it's on the anvil?
It has been looking like it's on the anvil for the last 3 years, unfortunately. So, I mean, so my hope remains, and I'm not like overly bearish. So I do believe that there's a reasonable chance that, I mean, if you look into FY20 at least, if you look at the big corporate banks, earnings will come back, and with the rupee depreciation, some of the exporters' earnings will come back. So there's some reasonable chance or hope that it comes back. But given at the valuation levels that you are at, which Ramdev has, I think, a very good report, I must say, on Ramdev's part, and the data he's shown, I do believe that you need a very strong surge in earnings. And it can happen, but I think, frankly, it's 50-50. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's tough to say.
Well, before I hand it to Professor Damani for the tough question, may I take the liberty of questioning you? What's the sense you're getting, Mr. Damani? Are you getting a sense that, for 4 years now, we've been saying second half earnings growth will come. Now, can we still go with that hope?
Thanks, Lata. Thank you, Ramdev, for a great presentation, as always. I was born a Taurus, so my birth sign is a bull. So, I don't get bearish very easily. There was a problem in the market. I think the way the market responds in the last few days suggests it's fighting back. It's ignoring bad news. It's going up. 5 stocks in the A group have made a new high, which is something I take very seriously. A couple of stocks in B groups have climbed up to a new high. And there's probably extra amount of pessimism. I don't do numbers like Ramdev and Akash do, perhaps. I don't look at the Sensex averages. I look at my individual companies, and I'm finding a lot of bargains in my portfolio. And I don't think bull markets stop out like what happened in early October. I think this is a very serious correction in a bull market, but I think we'll go on to make new highs shorter. And individual stocks, I'm very confident now, will start making new highs, because actually some companies, at least in this basket, are reporting very superior earnings here. So I'm not bearish, if that answers your question.
So if I can just continue with that. I mean, we, after some time, are seeing capital goods companies making money. At the same quarter where consumer goods have actually disappointed. I mean, all the two-wheelers are disappointing. Maruti, I mean, one never thought that we could see this kind of, not just, slower growth, but in 1 month, even contraction. So do you think if capital goods have started showing good numbers, we are somewhere looking like starting earnings growth?
It's always a good sign. I mean, remember in the 2003 bull market, my friend who is in the audience here gave me a great report on capital goods and how they were leading edge. And actually it turned out brilliantly. Some of the stocks are up 50x, 100x from that period. So that's a good leading indicator that, we're rebuilding the investment cycle. And that can't be all bad. Plus, what Ramdev mentioned today, that since the ease of doing business is growing up, that means more investment climate is getting more hospitable in India. So, I'm going to be optimistic, Lata.
That same year, Dr. Bimal Jalan was the governor of the Reserve Bank, and he pointed out that capital goods entry in the IIP, I mean, I know none of us look at it seriously, but whenever it goes, to high single digits, it is the coming in of high growth. And he was damn right in 2003 on hindsight. And after a lot of long lull, in the last 4 or 5 months, the IIP number, in the IIP basket, the capital goods number has shown double digits in many months. But it could be a stray observation. Now, once again, before I hand it over to Ramesh Dawani, let me come back to the questions on the science of identifying good companies. Ramdev gives us a very neat formula. When return on equity is higher than cost of equity, that is the surest formula. What's your formula, Akash?
No one formula, but I think what Ramdev has pointed out here, I think the very good framework, which is that ultimately when you look at a company, you're looking at net present value of future free cash flow, and you know what the current value of the company is. So you look at the current value and you look at what you're paying for future growth. And at the best determination of future value creation is, as Ramdev points out, I mean, people use it more for ROIC and sales growth. He's changed the proxy and made it ROE and profit growth, which is very similar. So I think that is the best framework to look at it, that what is the potential for value creation going forward, and you should look at expectations of ROE and profit growth. It's the best way to understand the value creation potential. So that's what we do. I think the problem we face, and which is what, comes out very clearly from Ramdev's study, is the problem today in India is a large part of the quality companies, what he defines as quality and grow, is they just have embedded growth expectations which are totally detached from economic history, right? I mean, his own numbers in his report shows you had one company or 5 companies delivering, 15 years of 20% earnings growth. Now, the way we do a framework is we look at, 5 or 10 years earnings. We take an exit P multiple. If you're entering with a, let's say, a P of 45 or 50, you assume need to make 18%, just as an example. And if you assume that at the end of 10 years, I want to exit not higher than 20 multiple, you need 35% earnings growth. The reality is, there are not more than 2 companies in India which have delivered 35% over the last 15 years. But there are 100 companies in India today embedding that growth expectation. So either something has changed in the next 15 years, which has not happened in the last 15 years. So we have a fundamental problem with this because we are unable to buy any of these companies because our framework doesn't allow us to buy it. But they don't come down, so that's what it is.
Mr. Dawani.
Lata, I think just to add to what Mr. Prakash said, I think all investments, as Buffett explained in his 2000 letter, comes down to a simple parable. A bird in hand is worth 2 in the bush. And all you need to find out is how sure the birds are there, how much time it will take you to get those 2 birds, and what is the appropriate discounting rate after that. I think once you do that, all investments can be explained, and that won't change if the internet comes in online, whether charts look good or whether people are optimistic or pessimistic. So whether you do any investment, I think for the price, as Ramdev pointed out in his QGLP quadrilateral, is the most important. I think the price covers a multitude of sins. And the way to understand it is, how much am I laying out today? How much will I get back tomorrow? I'll just give you an example just to state the case. In 1989, Buffett bought 10% of Coke. He paid $1 billion to buy 10% of Coke. Now, the first 10 years of his investment, the stock went up almost 20x. After that, for the next 20 years, it's gone flat. So his CAGR for the last 30 years in his most benchmark investment been roughly 10-11%. Okay, nothing great. Why does Buffett hold on to it dear life? Because the cash flow that Coke generates, on his original investment basis of $2.50, he's getting $1.50 or $1.60 as dividend. That's a 60% return on invested capital every year. Coke's dividends accumulate at 6% per year. So by 2026, it'll pay $2.50 per share in dividends. So you'll get 100% return on invested capital. So the cash outlay, he saw those two birds in the street in terms of Coke's cash flow over the few years. I think in the short run, discounted is important, but in the long run, how much cash does it throw back? And I think that is how you should look at investing. That's how you should look at all investing. There's no other way to look at it. How much cash will I get back?
Okay. Yours?
If I may make a trifle controversial comment here. I think India has become fashionable to say buy and hold forever.
Because you're...
It's just fashionable in India today. Buy and hold forever, and that's the only way to invest. I have a problem. I fundamentally disagree with that. I'm not saying it's the wrong way to invest. But I think that strategy has worked in India the last 5 or 10 years, as Ramdev's charts show. I would make a guess that we were sitting 10 years from now, that strategy will have shown to have been foolish. Because a lot of the companies you're owning, which are this buy and hold forever, trading at 50 multiple, 75 multiple, 80 multiple. Again, this is, I may not be around 10 years from now to talk to this audience, but I'm just saying I would like to make a wager that in 10 years' time, a lot of those companies will not have delivered anywhere near the type of returns that people think or are expecting. Because it is very fashionable. And I'm sorry, I'm being controversial when I say this. People don't like to hear this. But I'm telling you, in my humble opinion, this is gone to an extreme.
Well, why don't we get a mic to Mr. Sanjay Bhattacharya? Your comment. Okay. Actually, we should have a mic ready because there are so many stalwarts here who should be participating. Mr. Devani, your questions.
Sure. Akash and Ramdev, let me start with you, Ramdev. When you assess an investment, when an investment opportunity comes up to you, do you look at the intrinsic value of that company, or do you look at the margin of safety in the company, or do you find both very similar concepts?
So when I look at a company, I try to, so far, before this study, something will change after this study, but so far, I was looking at something where things can become, my classical investment is like HDFC Bank or even Hero Honda or where there's a lot of growth ahead. And one of the things is that the business is good and management is good. I was not very conscious of P to start with. But if these two deliver very high quality business, high quality management and reasonably high earnings growth. Little I knew that high growth could not continue beyond 5 years. But in my mind, I was building very high growth for a very long time. And if I can get it at 15, 20 P multiple, like one peg, if I can get it, that was my kind of way to go. Like in 2003, I bought Bharti. So at that time, value migration was happening. There was no telecom here, 40, 50 million lines for a country of 1,200 million people. And at that point of time, I read a paper where they said, we worked together in this, winner takes it all. So I was pushing for Bharti, and you also wanted to make money out of Tata Tele. Remember, we went and met the companies. So at that point of time, I was very clear, the company is going to make about 25,000 crores in next 5 years. And I was getting the stock at 5,000 crores. So for me, it was a no-brainer. So that's how you land up in opportunities. Sometimes you understand, and every time you don't understand. So when you keep getting this kind of, even in Infosys in 97, 98, Bhatta told me in 95, this is going to be a fantastic company. I said, sell the damn thing, we don't understand anything. I didn't know what is the difference between hardware and software in 95. In 97, 98, I was reading FT and there we found that there is a Y2K problem, this double-digit problem and all. You know it better. So then I realized that this has to be sorted, time-bound. And there is a global problem. So it's a huge opportunity. And that allowed India to come back into the... So Infosys was available at some 10, 12 P multiple.
12 P, yeah.
Less than 5, 6, 7,000 crores. And then the 100% growth started coming in for next 3, 4 years. That we didn't know. I bought it at reasonable price, at about 15, 17 P. See, once you buy reasonable, and after that growth builds up, that is not part of the calculation. It was a complete lottery, that it went to 1 lakh crore market cap from 10,000 crores. I actually ended up selling at 1 lakh crore plus. And like Eicher. In Eicher, I bought, I thought the truck will displace, the Eicher will become market leader compared to Telco and Ashok Leyland by 2020. So we bought the emerging market leader in trucks. Little we knew, the moment we buy truck, we'll stop selling. And what we'll start selling is the Fatfatia, that is called Royal Enfield. And that was not part of the calculation. And it, as if they were, all the users of Royal Enfield, they were waiting for me to buy the stock. The moment we bought, the growth started shooting up by 40-50%. And here you have from 5,000-6,000 crores to almost 90,000 crores. So sometimes
Luck helps.
luck also helps.
Give me lucky generals, as they said.
Yeah, so that has been this thing. I don't think the style should change. But now, one change I'll definitely make is that I'm not going to believe that any company can grow at a very high rate for more than 5-6 years.
Okay,
And
that's
one
of your
should also
findings.
avoid buying the companies, like growth here is year zero. So one should not buy the growth company after 5 years of growth is over. So there was one saying in Thomas Well's book that a lemon which is squeezed by a steamroller
Yeah.
has more juice left than a
than what is
discounted,
discounted by the market.
discounted information in the stock market. So I don't want to see what is happening is crazily that people are paying crazy price for growth which has already happened and there is very little left. So everybody is standing on the cliff.
No, by that logic, we should not be buying HDFC Bank now.
But is it the exception that proves the rule? Is HDFC Bank the exception that proves the rule?
It has been huge exception for last 20 years. From 96, from IPO day at 40 rupees, 800 crores market cap, 900 crores market cap. From there to reach 5.5 lakh crores and is still growing very strong at 20%. I think this is not Six Sigma event, I think it is 8 Sigma event. So it's very exceptionally well managed and delivered, but there also you have to be very cautious. Because on this base, how much they can deliver, what kind of growth. So you can't afford to pay some crazy price. And somehow market has been very disciplined throughout 20 years in valuation of HDFC Bank. But other companies, they go haywire. Like Infosys went to 200p. It started at 12p, went to 200, again came back to 12p.
But that's the nature of bubbles, that will take it up
Yeah.
to some
Yeah,
embedded
so you have to be
value.
lucky. You have to be lucky. The stock you buy, there only bubbles happens.
Yeah. But Ramdev, if I can summarize your style, and the stock picks that you made, it seems to me you're more of an intrinsic value hunter. You want to find the future cash flows, discount them, and see the. How about you, Akash? Are you more the intrinsic value guy? Are you looking at assets of a company and margin of safety, or do you prefer both?
No, I think we're more of a growth at a reasonable price type of approach, in the sense that I think we recognize that, as Ramdev's study itself points out, that India is a growth-oriented market, in the sense that people, if a company doesn't deliver earnings growth, the market penalizes it quite severely in India. So in fact, sometimes it's an opportunity. So I would say we are, we have a framework where we fade PE multiples. We look at what we think is the realistic multiple at the end of 5 years. We look at what is the earnings power of the company. What would we pay for this company? So let's say you're buying a company today, let's say, 25 times earnings. You look at what you think the next 5-7 years earnings growth will look like, and then given its ROIC and ROE profile, what is the fair exit multiple for this? And you look at that, say it's 20 times or whatever, and then you see what's the expected IRR you get from here to there. I think I actually found Ramdev's study very, very interesting, because it just further reinforced my view that the point he makes, that like the HDFC Bank is truly an exception, in the sense it is not common for companies to deliver 15, 20 years of 20-25% earnings growth. We all wish there were more companies like that. Unfortunately, there are very, very few. And you can argue the one or two you find, probably maybe those you should never sell because they're truly unique. But the reality is, for every 100 companies the market prices like that, maybe only 2 or 3 actually are like that. Right. And that's the reality. So our view is that you look at a fair price, look at the earnings power, look at, given the return on capital metrics, what's an appropriate exit multiple, and look at your expected IRR if you buy it today at that.
Would you say then the expected cash flows that you're discounting in your target company is actually your margin of safety, as opposed to a breakdown of the assets
Yeah,
the company
clearly
might
cash
have.
flow. We don't look at price to book that much. We don't look at hard asset values. So we are clearly earnings and cash flow driven, clearly. And we look at free cash also a lot because very often there are companies where in some exceptional cases you have earnings cash flows much higher than earnings, which can also happen. Negative working capital companies, companies with zero capex. So we look at actual genuine free cash because very often a PAT is not free cash, right? I mean, the very different elements of free cash. Two companies, 100 rupees profit after tax, doesn't mean they have the same free cash flow. No. It's very different. So we also look at what is the actual conversion of PAT to free cash. That also drives the P multiple. If someone has a 90% conversion of PAT to free cash, it deserves a higher multiple, assuming same growth rate, same ROIC profile, than someone who has only a 30% conversion of PAT to free cash flow.
But let me just pick your brain, Akash. At some point, 2013, 14, the oil marketing companies, all right? They were available at 10,000 crores market cap. These companies were built in the 50s and 60s. A huge asset base, huge discount. Inflation had market completely ignored the inflation. Isn't your job as a stock picker to kind of say, deregulation's coming, these are huge margin of safety businesses. Did you buy it or why didn't you buy it if you didn't?
No, we stayed away from them because our fundamental view has always been that we don't think the government of India as an owner of equity is optimizing for shareholder returns. Plain and simple. So we don't want an owner whose primary determinant of running the company is not optimizing shareholder value. The government runs the companies and it's their right. They're the majority owners. I'm not criticizing why they do what they do. I'm just saying their objectives are different. I don't want to be in a company where the promoter, in this case, for you might call it the owner, has objectives very different from shareholder maximization.
But Akash, isn't that a blind spot? Can't things be cheap enough that it doesn't matter whether the government's running it or a private sector?
That's not my style. I am not willing to, I don't care whether the stock is trading at 5p, 10p. My view is that yes, there may be one or two stocks which break out and make money, but I'll make 8 mistakes trying to find those 2 which make sense, right? So my view is that the probability is low. So yes, there will be a breakout like the oil marketing companies which finally have created significant value. But my view is over a 20-year horizon, I can miss those 3 oil marketing companies and avoid the 20 mistakes I would have made buying NTPC or BHEL or Bank of Baroda or whatever other stuff there is.
But Ramdev, you clearly agree with him. It's your passion to say PSUs are going to zero, right?
Yeah, I mean, but I was in different camp. I bought like big time into HPBP, right at the, deregulation. And I paid the heavy price also, in the sense that I saw the stock going 6-7x. So on the whole, I would have not lost. But we are a little more buy and hold types, not forever, but still we hold for a very long period. So we kept on holding. Little we knew that oil price will go up. So that was kind of okay. I was knowing it's a transfer pricing for the oil. You make $2, but little I knew that this government will actually, what is the fear of Akash? That actually turned out to be true. And market was also right that they literally took away from that candy, 2 rupees they were getting. One candy they snatched from the hands of HP and BP.
But that risk runs in private companies, Ram. The regulatory, the government can tell you the broadcasting people charge 10 rupees only per channel as opposed to 20 rupees.
Yeah,
it happened in Inox theaters. So what? That's a risk you valued at a price.
Yeah, so I went
Why are you
wrong.
so biased against PSUs?
No, I'm not saying that, but one of the things is that what I realize, if you see the history of PSUs, it is raised to zero. Every company, they reached the prominence, say BSNL. They were telecom giant. Today, the condition you see.
So did RCOM. So what? Why single out PSUs? I can name you 50 private company stocks that are raised to zero.
No, there must be thousands of private sector companies, but that is there.
Can you give me a public sector Maruti?
Right, there you go. Maruti was in the public sector, it's still this thing. I think the National Stock Exchange does a great job. Look at the cash flows that they're generating. I made 20, 30, 40x in PSU stocks. It is just a valuation matter. You buy it cheap enough that it's like a cigarette puff. You won't get wrong.
I agree with you. I'm still holding these stocks. But I'm going through all the pain. But what I'm saying is that the experience is not very good. And it is, we take my experience is not good. I agree with his thought process more. I wish I was as wise as Akash and avoid the whole damn thing. But I think the way it is being managed, government companies, I think we got to be really careful putting serious money into this. Some speculative bet, okay, this thing is coming, so you are getting a 3P, 4P, let's do some fun, speculative bet, it goes double or triple, get out. But I think buy and hold, of course not.
Yeah, I'll just add an anecdote, Lata, first turn to you, because when I was researching for this conference that we're putting today, I read one of the great examples of a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, and I want to share that with the audience. In fact, almost, I think, 30 years ago, on November 6, 1986, one of the great deals in technology was signed by Bill Gates. He signed a deal with IBM to license MS-DOS. Previously, they wanted to buy a CP/M operating system, but they couldn't come to a price, maybe $200,000. So Bill Gates offered them for $50,000 plus per user license fee. Per user license fee. And in the contract, he wrote a small note that I can sell this to anyone I want. All right? So IBM said, fine. So very soon, people started cloning the IBM platform. All right? And when they wanted an operating system, they had to go to MS-DOS, which Bill Gates was happy to charge per user charge for using the MS-DOS. And that ability to give up that $200,000 upfront allowed him to build $1 trillion company as a result. I mean, it's one of those astounding deals that Bill Gates and IBM owned the PC market, and they just gave it up. Today, IBM is struggling at a $100 billion market cap, and Microsoft is $1 trillion.
Okay, well, I wanted to make it a little simpler. Sectors, Ramdev, I'm looking at the biggest wealth generators, the fastest wealth generators, the most consistent wealth generators. The common factor is consumer goods. There are no prizes for doing hard work. The prizes are all for the easy work of consumer goods. So would you say that consistent, fastest, biggest wealth generators are normally to be found in consumer goods?
The consistent wealth creating company, incidentally, 10 out of 10 this time are consumer facing companies. Even the banks, like HDFC Bank is there is also a consumer bank. If they were in corporate lending, probably they would have not made it to the list. So clearly, I mean, Indian consumer has been probably most predictable, most consistent, and with a 7.5% GDP growth rate, with nominal growth of about 11-12%, very predictable in last 15-20 years, and next 10, 15, 20 years. Probably one of the reasons these consumer companies are getting crazy P multiple is because first, there are very few of them. In all the segments, they are kind of a duopolistic or monopolistic, and they are managed extremely well, and predictability of their current profits and some amount of growth is also very high. So longevity of these franchises are almost guaranteed. At least that's what the market believes, that nobody can topple them from their position. But the moment business is not consumer, then all kinds of uncertainties start coming. If you see, there is no pharma and even tech companies in this study, in this consistent. And that is a very surprising thing, that because the tech has been so consistently wealth creating, but in last 5-7 years, the challenge of growth has pushed them out also. Because now, it is not guaranteed that they will keep growing at 15%. If they had been growing at 15% even, they would have made it to the list. So one, the correction in the value, and second, the predictable growth. Because now it is dependent on Mr. Trump or American demand or whatever, which is not reliable. So I think it is the predictability of the earnings and stability of the franchise which is pulling it here. And I think this list is not fundamentally going to change much. Look at the best one, Titan. I mean, it's a jewelry company, and that has made it 33% compounded. No, at least I didn't think that it will be such a great wealth creator for such a long period.
If I may also add to Ramdev's point, I think the consumer stocks also have benefited from the fact that you had horrendous earnings growth for the rest of the market for the last 5 to 10 years. So in an environment where there is very low predictability of earnings, where every year earnings are disappointing, the consumer stocks have been very stable, consistent, and frankly, as advertised. They've delivered 15 or 20% earnings growth. If you look at Ramdev's own charts, all of them are between 15 or 20% by and large earnings growth for 10 years. Now, that's not spectacular, but it's very good, and great cash flows and great ROEs. So if you go back to 03 to 07, 08, when earnings growth for the markets exploded, the consumer stocks actually were not leading the way, because it was for lack of a better word, 15, 20% earnings growth was frankly the market's earnings growth. So they said, oh, what's the big deal? Why will I pay 30 times for this? I can get 20% earnings growth anywhere. But in an environment the last 5, 7 years where you have not been able to get earnings growth anywhere, then 15, 20% earnings growth is incredibly valuable. So I think the consumer stocks, beyond the fact that they are, and this is true globally, outstanding businesses and they deserve a higher valuation. But the last 5 years in India, they've been the only beacon of growth and stability that you've had. And in a very tough earnings environment where everything else is blowing up around you in terms of not delivering earnings, the fact that they've delivered what they said they would deliver, it's attracted a lot of capital.
Well, let me actually relate this before I put the same question to you to this whole private public theme. Consumer goods are the ones that have least regulations. So in that context, Ramesh, Bharti and Maruti listed between 2 or 3 years of each other. And Bharti also gave, it was a consumer good, and gave excellent results up to a point until regulation took over. Or maybe you can even say competition, but it was more regulation, spectrum charges, and other issues. So, is there a theme there? How to not select stocks? How to cancel stocks in the list? Is regulation a no-no? An over-regulated sector, red flag?
Where I disagree with this gentleman is that, stock selection is always important. And I'm happy to buy a PSU stock, I'm happy to buy a telecom stock at what I think is the right price. And I will sell it. When the bird is not worth two in the bush, I'm happy to sell the stock. I agree with Akash, you shouldn't keep these stocks for a lifetime. There are a lot of stocks that you want to sell. But I'm a reluctant seller. I'm not going to just sell it because I think the P has gone to 35. Market can make it 60p, make it 200p, as happened with Infosys. So at this point, I'm still drinking the Kool-Aid regarding consumer stocks. I'm not going to sell them, despite being expensive.
Okay, that brings me to the real next theme that I want to ask of you. Selling discipline. Akash, what are the rules you follow? When do you sell?
Well, first of all, I will say that in my opinion, especially in a market like India, the selling decision is a far more difficult decision than the buying decision. And the reason for that is in India, you can justify anything on a 10-year basis, right? Because everything is underpenetrated. We have 8% growth forever. So anything can be justified. So it's far more difficult to sell, in my opinion, especially a good quality company than to buy it. It's much simpler to buy. So one is that comment. Second is the way we look at it, as I said, we have the framework of we look at earnings on a 5 to 7 year basis. We look at the price we are paying to buy today. We look at what the earnings power of the company is at the end of 5, 7 years, what we think is an appropriate multiple, which is linked to its earnings growth and ROIC. And then we look at what the expected IRR is from buying today to then. If the expected IRR falls below 7, 8%, we'll sell. Because our view is that if all I'm going to get from here to then is fixed deposit interest rates, that's not what I'm buying equity for, the risk is too high. So, but of course, and the other problem in selling also happens in India very often is, let's say you buy something at 100. Your expectation is that at the end of 3 years, it should be worth 200, at which time you'll sell. At the end of 1 year, it goes to 165. Now what do? Right? This is a classic dilemma, right? So what we do then is you obviously reassess, why has it gone up so much? Were your earnings too low? Were your estimates too low, et cetera, et cetera? But if on your best, most optimistic estimates, whatever you have out there, and on a very realistic P multiple, if your expected IRR is only 7, 8%, we'll sell. And we will make the occasional mistake. We will miss some companies where we'll sell too early. But I think that's a price worth paying because we'll avoid the 15 stocks where we were lazy and our IRR fell from 25% to 5% because we just sat there, right? So I think it's a tough decision, but I think you've got to force yourself to look at, what is the earnings power? What are you paying for? What is the realistic growth rate? What is the realistic P multiple? And what is your expected IRR from here? Take your most optimistic assumptions. But even if on that, your IRR is 5, 6%, why are you owning the stock? Yeah. So that's our self-discipline.
Yeah, we know one person who made a selling mistake with United Spirits. So, Ramesh, how do you take selling decisions?
I take a more holistic approach than Akash, where he goes through each individual company and looks through it out there. I look at my portfolio very closely on an aggregate basis, and I'm looking to double my money every 3 years, 4 years. And broadly, if that's happening, I'm let my stocks run because I realize some businesses go through some time. But if I think a bull market is ending, if I feel the bull market is ending, I want to sell and get into cash. Because I know that every bull market that ends means 30, 50, 60% drop in your portfolio value. So you're in a quandary in a situation like this, when October could have been a bull market top, could have been in a correction. I'm hoping it's a correction. If it was a bull market top, I should have been in cash. Because history tells us, any bull market top, 92, 2000, 2008, stocks will correct 50%, the Sensex will correct 50%. So that's one criteria I use. The other criteria, of course, if there's such a discrepancy between the intrinsic value of what I think the company is worth and what the market is quoting at, occasionally that will happen, then I will pull the trigger. But generally, I have harder criteria for entry for my core stocks than for exit. I'll be running it with a bit of latitude.
You haven't gone into cash lately, have you?
Minimal.
All right, that's a confidence then. Ramdev, do you have any formula for selling? Other than, of course, price-value discrepancy is an obvious one.
So I think I have been disaster in selling because I've been big bucked of Buffett, so I'm more tended towards buy and hold. So one of the thought process I had till this study, because after this we have not done the thing. So one of the things was that if the company is great and the story is right and the earnings are growing, even if it is horribly expensive, don't come in front of a speeding truck. If the companies are growing, because you don't know whether it is another HDFC, it is another lever or something, where re-rating will keep happening. I mean, that's the hope. That was the hope. If the earnings growth of 25-30% is coming, little I knew that earnings growth cannot continue at that level for more than 5 years. That I knew now. So I'll be more calibrated, but the whole idea was that if my earnings growth is visible to me for next 2-3 years, I mean, assessing every quarter, every day, and if I see that earnings is coming, even if it is expensive, I am not sold. In any case, I never sit on cash, whether top of the market or bottom of the market. So life is somewhat simple. But, I mean, whenever markets are at crazy levels, low levels, that time I feel bad. I don't have cash to buy anything. So, but you repent once in 7-8 years. But rest of the 9-10 years, you have fun because you are fully invested. So I think going in cash has not been that rewarding. And in any case, even if I go 10% in cash, 90% in any case I am bought. So should I pray to the God for market to come down or market to go up?
Any example where you sold too early?
Pardon?
Any example where you sold too early and therefore you learnt a lesson?
No, you should ask for the example, did you sell too late? I don't think I sold anything too early, definitely not. But one or two sale I had done just on time, right at the top, like Infosys. I mean, at 11,000, I mean, of course, the tip or support was given by Bhatta to me. And Bhatta was way ahead. He had visited Japan in '93, and he knew that software is coming like a big one. So he bought it literally throwaway prices. I bought it a little expensive. I said, run at 1 lakh crore. I could see the craziness. In fact, I had gone to Omaha, and there Buffett was penalized in 2000 before the collapse. And you can check, the Wall Street Journal wrote, Mr. Buffett, you must apologize for not investing in technology. That was just before and then next year, there were 5 minutes standing ovation for not investing in technology. You know?
I remember that. I remember that headline.
To repeat the parable I told you, Lata, that a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. He said there are no birds and there's no bush. Why investing in internet companies?
Okay, go ahead.
So that benefited me. So I sold all my technology companies. My portfolio in 2001 was 100 crores. We started from zero 12 years back. At 2001, I had 100 crores worth of portfolio. Out of that, 80% was technology. They were bloated like big time. And so I started selling Infosys right at 11,000. And NIT, I sold it some 43,000, 4,300. Hughes Telecom, I sold it 4,300. I think NIT, I sold it 3,400. So I was very clear that I am selling right at the top. But little I knew what to do with the money. I was a compulsive buyer. What I did, I bought Ghatia companies in the same sector at 15p, which became zero.
It's a great lesson.
That, I'll just bring you back to what we were discussing, very intrinsic value. And as a professional, and so you bought a Hero Honda or you bought Bharti, and you figured out it's a discount to intrinsic value. Do you do DCF, over the last 10 years to figure out, or do you say this is the range of probable outcomes over the next, say, 3 to 5 years? How do you approach quantifying intrinsic value?
Yeah, so for me, it was the payback ratio. This I had read a Canadian research paper way back in 2003. So if you see our papers, every year we keep doing this ratio of payback ratio.
Just explain one more time,
which is current market cap divided by your estimated total profit in next 5 years.
Right.
Because whatever you're buying, you're looking into the future.
And if it's 1, it's great.
Pardon?
If you get a ratio 1, that's
One,
great.
you are sitting on a
You're
multi-bag.
set.
And if it is
Absolutely.
by chance half, then you are talking about 5-year payback. Now the way it works is, it is a compounding and summation of compounding. Because something is growing at 40% compounded, say 25% compounded for next 10 years. What is the total money the company is going to make? I know it is 42 times. So current profit is 100 rupees. And in next 10 years, the total profit the company is going to make is 4,200. Now what is the stock price? Is the stock price, say 500 rupees or 1,200 rupees? And so if you like the stock, and this kind of valuation you get, at least we used to get it till about 2013 or so. After that, I think this game is not
We're
working.
probably still getting them now after this
Now I
correction.
think it is emerging
Still
slowly.
getting there, yeah.
Little more kind of a correction, and we'll get a lot more.
I never believed you would agree with your friend Alok on valuations going down all the time. Akash, what about you?
The problem with this, 1 minute, sorry. The problem with this 5-year, growth story or growth formula is that every analyst we interview on the channel tells us that there is going to be 20% earnings growth this year. And by the time we come to the end of the year, it has come down to high single digits, 9%. So it's not very easy to get this 5-year growth trajectory right,
That
isn't it?
distinguishes the Rembrandts from the regular run-of-the-mill guys.
Ramdevs
And
from the other
The
analysts.
artists get this right. Akash, just how do you do DCF?
Well, we don't actually do a formal DCF in most cases. I think there are certain companies where it is amenable. So like, for example, maybe certain consumer good companies and certain situations, you can do a DCF. But we don't do it for everything. I think we look more, as I said, at earnings trajectory, earnings power, ROIC, what's the adjustable market. So we really chart out what we think the next 5-7 years earnings growth will be like. So it's an approximation of earnings power. I don't think anybody, frankly, we can sit here and tell you that we have any, phenomenal level of precision. We don't. I mean, 5 years out, 7 years out, obviously is a guesstimate. But you look at the competitive position, that's where all the softer things come into it, quality of management, the competitive position of the company, industry structure, stuff like that. So you come to an estimate of what you think is a reasonable earnings power for this company, given its competitive position, quality of management, etc. And what you think is an appropriate multiple on that. That's how we normally do it. There are some companies which are very cash flow amenable where you can do a DCF. So we do that once in a while. But we don't do a DCF for every company that we've invested in.
How many years out are you comfortable looking at a company's earnings? 3 years, 5 years out? What is your time frame that you try and assess the profitability?
We try, normally I would say around 5 years. Even 5 years, frankly, beyond a point is a shot in the dark. I mean, I think realistically, I would be lying if I said I have any great visibility 5 years forward. But so you make an estimate of what you think is reasonable, what's realistic, and that's really, where you're, for lack of a better word, the better you understand the company, the better chance you have of making a reasonable forecast of what that earnings is 5 years down the road. And that's why sometimes when we've made mistakes and we sold too early, I actually don't feel bad. I've always told our team we don't deserve to have made money in this company because we could not understand how powerful it was or how strong the earnings trajectory was. So you try 5 years, you do the best you can, and you try to, understand the company as best as you possibly can. But I mean, Ramesh, you are a practitioner like all of us. Realistically, I mean, it's a tough job to do. I mean, you try your best, but you can't assume that you have any great level of precision there.
You'd rather be approximately correct than precisely wrong, as they say.
Yeah, exactly.
Lata?
Totally.
Actually, what is the strike rate when you make a 5-year forecast? How many times do you get it right?
Not, yeah, not very often, Lata, not very often. 5-year forecast, I mean, as he said, companies could go in a completely different line of business, succeed for completely other reasons. So it's a hazardous profession, forecasting 5 years, at least for me it has
And
been.
it depends what you define as right. I mean, if you define as right in terms of precision, I think probably very low. If you define right as being right in the sense of a reasonable order of magnitude, I think you can have a reasonable chance of getting that approximately right. Nobody can tell you that this company will make 1,000 crores in 5 years. That is, I mean, impossible.
Sometimes it's just so obvious that it stares at you in the face. So you don't really need to do DCF. It just stares at you. It can't be this, and I think you make your bet accordingly.
Your thoughts, since you make this formula of 5 years?
Yeah, I think one of the realization in this study while we're running the data is that when the markets in general are reasonably priced, you get a lot of these opportunities. And economy is doing well, both combinations. Somehow, I mean, this is a very demanding market. Actually, total market cap is not that high. For 180 lakh crores GDP, your market cap is only 135. It's about 70 to 73%. So it's not that high at all. Like US is trading at 150%. But their corporate profits are at the peak. And our corporate profits are at 3% to GDP. They're at 9-10%. We're at 3%. It's crazy. I mean, I think we cannot go any lower. So that option value of growth going from 3% to 5 or 6% and in next 4-5 years is very high. And probably market is trading and those kind of things. So when the P multiples are low or reasonable, like in 2003, anybody, if by memory, anybody has bought anything in 2003, here it is a multi-bagger. I bought a company called Birla Corp at $7 a ton cement. Today, even at $70, you will not get even a useless company. So that's the kind of valuation range you are talking about. In 2003, market was at 11p or 12p, 11p I think. And 88% of the companies were below 20p. There were no company above 40p. Today, I mean at the March, 27% of the company, means out of 700, almost 170 companies were above 40p and significantly above. So that's the kind of, so you like the company, you understand the company. First thing is, most difficult is to understand the company and the business. And what you understand, and you somehow find some clue or you understand, when you go to look at the P, I mean the valuation, it is at 40p, it looks like it is giving you current, So that's the kind of situation it is. So it is very difficult, probabilistically very difficult to find a terrific idea at a reasonable price. That's the kind of situation. The situation will change.
Let me just ask them one question,
Page
Lata.
22, actually. I mean, for the benefit of the audience, I think that's a very telling graph.
Yeah. But, Ramdev, since you completed the series now, over 23 years, Q, G, LP, you position all of them. Which one is the most important to you?
Of course, the last study, the current one. Because ultimately, you cannot get into serious valuation kind of study till you understood the value component of it. QGL is the value. And that value...
Must be embedded in the price to be attractive.
So what is the price you are willing to pay for that value? If you don't understand what quality means, what free cash flow means, what longevity means, what compounding means, what is summation of compounding means, what is the good management means, if you don't understand these components, I mean, straight getting into valuation would be a very shallow job. So, of course, this is the most important one.
Akash, between the quadrilateral of Q, G, LP.
It's a tough one. I think the one, it's a tough one, but I think the one which I think is, in my opinion, underestimated the most is actually longevity. Because I think that's something people don't focus enough on, in the sense that, what is the window, which is what longevity I think Ramdev means, what is the window through which this company can generate an ROI or ROIC higher than its cost of capital, and for how long, and for what magnitude? Because that makes a huge difference to your assessment of intrinsic value. And I think when we've made mistakes, and we've made, unfortunately, a lot of them, but when we've made our mistakes, it is fundamentally misunderstanding longevity. Whether it is we've overestimated it and paid too much, or underestimated it and not realized how valuable a company is. I think quality, growth, price, all well understood. And Ramdev done it very well. I think the factor which people don't focus enough on, and in my opinion at least, is longevity, because it can totally change your assessment of value. If you have a company which can grow, let's say, 15 years and maintain its, its ROIC at way above cost of capital, and compared to that, the company which is only 5 years, as Ramdev's chart showed, it's an exponential difference in assessment of intrinsic value between those two companies. And at least when I look at analyst reports and talk to people, people don't spend enough time thinking about that. If this company has a 30% return on invested capital, how sustainable is that and for how long? And how much capital can you invest at that 30% ROIC? The other point is how much capital can you invest at that, right?
I just want to ask a follow-up question to Akash. I mean, something I wanted to understand from Ramdev, I'll ask you and then go to Ramdev. When you talk about needing more capital to reinvest in the business and capital, are there a segment of businesses that will just survive by raising prices? Will not necessarily need a lot of capital, will just have pricing power. Is that a segment to look at? Is there any businesses like that that have pricing power as opposed to needing capital reinvested?
Of course, I mean that, in my view, that is the fundamental, you could argue in a way, those are the platform companies, right? In the sense that, I'll give you an example. Company we own, I don't want to get into stocks, but like, InfoEdge, for example, if you look at Naukri.com, zero need of capital, zero. Its cash flows are 150% of earnings because it's negative working capital, zero capex, and it has pricing power because it's now got 80% market share on traffic.
Right.
And you see this quarter, they've taken pricing up 10%. First time they've started exercising pricing power. So those are actually outstanding businesses. I think this is the thing. If you can get a moat with a reinvestment opportunity, that's the best outcome. If you get a moat without reinvestment opportunity, which has pricing power, also incredibly valuable. But personally, I prefer a moat with a reinvestment opportunity.
Which case would be to buy newer companies that are floating around for InfoEdge?
Yeah, something like that type, yeah.
Right.
So in that case, do you see your investment philosophy evolving? You start, when you were 10 years ago, your parameters were something else, and now you're looking at companies very differently. Your philosophy changes.
Yeah, because I think the reality is the companies of this type didn't exist 15, 20 years ago, in the sense that you didn't have these type of network effect companies or platform-based companies, very rare. And in India, at least, were very, very rare. I think as India, you're seeing this new generation of companies, some of them listed, more will list. The reality is a company, take the US example, it's better to talk US than India for the regulatory reasons, but I'm just saying, take the example of Netflix, for example. A company like that would have been unthinkable 15 years ago. Now look at the network effect it has. It has got dominance. And they have pricing power. If you look at Netflix, they've taken up pricing 7% CAGR in the last 10 years. And they have tremendous pricing power. So I think the nature of business is evolving. In fact, one of the difficulties we have is to keep up. Right? How do you keep up? That's the difficulty. Yeah, so.
Well, actually, in the QGLP, where do you stand, Ramesh?
I'm a big votary for P. I think price covers a multitude of sins, and you can buy cigarette puffs and make money. You can buy sometimes poor quality companies. Not that we should, but you can end up making money because price discounts everything. I think as Ramdev put it, market is a steamroller. Sometimes it squeezes everything out, but occasionally for whatever reason, it gives astonishing bargains. You scratch your head. How can that possibly be? And you lose your confidence. But so I'm a votary of P.
Well, now let me come to another journalist question. NBFC companies, sometimes after this big heady rise and the way they are correcting now, it reminds me of the way infrastructure companies were valued in 2008, 2007, 2008, or maybe even continued up until 12, and then we saw them tumble. Very few, I think almost none, survived. Should we compare it like that at all, NBFC companies, or it's not comparable and many will survive?
I think that would be, in my opinion, an unfair comparison. To put it bluntly, if you look at infrastructure companies on a classic DCF, the value was zero from day one because there's zero free cash flow over the entire life of the company, in most cases. So that was La La Land when people were giving 50 multiple for some infrastructure company, whatever. It absolutely made no sense. On Ramdev's framework, you would give zero value. right? I think you can't equate NBFCs to that. I think NBFC is a case maybe of valuation expectations being too high. In the sense people have taken the last 3 years of easy liquidity, low short-term interest rates, significant growth opportunity because the public sector banks are not able to lend, and extrapolated that for 10 years, which I think maybe have been an excess. So you may argue that they were too richly valued. But I don't think it's fair to say that NBFCs don't have value, or there's not a business model, or there's a big governance issue. I think that would be very unfair, in my opinion, at least.
It's a sector that's going to really do well. I mean, considering that public sector banks are getting fewer and fewer in number in terms of effective competition, what would you say about this NBFC? Valuation and now the correction. Is it more or less
Above
done?
my pay grade. Above my pay grade. I'll let them answer this question. I want to ask him about a follow-up question on longevity, though. James Bond says diamonds are forever, and you said stocks aren't forever. So then, what is the longevity construct that you're looking for? Are there businesses that actually can meet that longevity test that you look for? And what are those kind of businesses? And would you look only at those businesses then for the L?
No, I think the point I was trying to make was that, there is the occasion, like for example, if say 10 years ago or 15 years ago, if you had used simple numbers and said that, look, there's no company which has grown more than 15 years at 25% earnings, you would have missed HDFC Bank, right? Because it has, right? And there's
That's
some
a black swan, though.
Yeah, no, not necessarily a black swan. There are some. The point I was trying to make with a comment in the initial part of our conversation was, the market is today assuming a lot more companies have that longevity than I think ultimately will be proven right. That some will have the longevity, of course. There will be some.
Which are those sectors of businesses? Which are those sectors of businesses that you think meet the L test? Alcohol, cigarettes?
No, it depends, Ramesh. Some consumer names, some banks also. It frankly depends on a unique confluence of business opportunity, business model, and quality of management. And I think a framework Ramdev has used very, very well, which is value migration. I think value migration is a unique opportunity in India because in so many sectors, you're seeing value move from the public sector to the private sector.
But that's destructive. That's not longevity. Value migration is destructive.
No, it's destructive for one, but it's longevity for the other.
And another value set, another creative destruction will happen to today's winners. 10 years on the road.
Maybe, but longevity does not mean forever. Longevity just means that it may be 15 years, 20 years. You don't know. My simple point that I'm saying is that you have two approaches. You can take a simplistic approach and say that look at economic history. Not more than 2 companies in Ramdev's own data over the last 20 years have delivered more than 15% earnings growth or 20% earnings growth over 20 years. So I can take that approach and say my probability is only 2 out of whatever, from God knows how many thousand. Is it worth it? That's one approach. I'm saying, but that may be 2. So that is frankly perfectly legit. I'll leave those 2 companies out. I'll face everything else. But I think there's enough effort, energy, and drive that you can do to try to understand that some companies may genuinely be unique. My only simple point is they are very rare. And the second point I would make is when you get them, like Ramdev says, you should have very high levels of allocation to them. The mistake we've made when you found those longevity companies, you haven't bet the house. Because they're so rare, you should bet the bloody house.
Great point. Ramdev, your thoughts on the longevity? Are there some, in your Porter framework that you included in your report, there were some businesses that seem to meet that test. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So what we have seen is that longevity comes from the competitive position of the company. And India is one place where almost every business is growing, and they'll keep growing for next 25, 30, 40 years. Now, the competitive position for a lot of companies are unique. Say Diageo, India, that UNSP, or look at Maruti, look at even Hero MotoCorp, or look at now Indigo, the new kid in the block. More than 40-45% market share of the entire aviation. We have not even started flying. So the kind of competitive position you are creating, creating wealth is one part of it, what price you buy, what happens to the many other variables. But actually, say there is a value migration in, say, life insurance. People have not even started insuring. I'm quite sure not even 30-40% of the people who are sitting here would have insurance here. So the insurance market is going from public to private, and penetration is going from 5-10% to like, so it's a very long this thing. But this business is completely entry barriered. Everybody, everybody is allowed to get the license. Government gives you license by tons. But who can make money? So the moment there is an entry barrier, one is your competitive position is high. And one thing I'm seeing more recently is the Lindy effect. Where this Lindy effect, it's a cafe in New York where people come and discuss which show at Broadway is going to be lasting 100 days, 200 days, 500 days. Because you make money only if it lasts more than 100 days. So they have found the shows which have done 100 days, only those shows will go to 200 days. And the shows which have done 200 days will go to 400 days. So
First you got to go to 100 days.
So the success is anti-aging. As success becomes matured and entrenched, nobody can touch them.
But Ramdev, you mentioned these stats to me. So it's not an accident in my view. Best performing stock in India over 30 years, ITC. Best performing stock in America over 70 years, Philip Morris. Best performing stock in Japan, Japan Tobacco. Habits die hard. So is longevity also a matter of finding, as Akash said, a rare company which caters to our habits, like tobacco, alcohol?
Because human being is same. In 40, 50 years or maybe 60 years, what has changed? Except for a telephone on our pocket, nothing much has changed. We eat the same food, we eat the same brands, our life is more or less same. So anything around consumer is very predictable. For next 70 years, at least, I don't know what the next generation will do, but at least this generation is very predictable for next 25, 30 years. So anything which is non-disruptive in terms of technology, and it is part of the habit formation. And you have a dominant position. You've got it.
We hope the habit forming will include watching CNBC and you all the time.
So, okay, well, I wanted to ask you, Ramdev, in particular, is there a different valuation or investment matrix when you invest public money versus private money?
This is, I think Akash will tell more because he's been managing money from 92 onwards when the Morgan Stanley Growth Fund came, isn't it? So he has managed local money, global money, lot of money, and now he's managing kind of pooled money for global investors. So he has a lot of experience, but I find it exciting but very challenging. Because in private money, you can go wrong and go to sleep and nobody asks any question. You can buy very dirty company and actually lose money and nobody will say anything. But in public money, see, for 10 good things, nobody will say thanks. But for one bad thing, you get tons of, and now with social media, everybody is free to write whatever they want to write. So I think the cost you pay, you got to be, first thing is thick-skinned while managing public money. And second, you got to be really, to manage public money as your own money is very tough call. And this, since I'm a owner and investor and public manager, and my money is with the public money, so still I bring that, proprietary kind of attitude. But I think for a completely hired guy, who is probably sitting in Singapore, Hong Kong, or New York or somewhere managing 10, 15, 20 billion dollars, I think it is very tough to give that personalized touch to the selection of stocks. Wherever there is a risk, they will run.
So there'll be a herd mentality more.
Herd mentality, but just the fear, the loss aversion, or performance is not the criteria. You must not make losses. You should not be questioned for what you have bought. Because when anybody buys, I think they buy with good intention. Later on, when it has gone wrong, then you come and slap me. So we buy looking forward, but we are appraised looking backward, which is, in your own money, that doesn't happen.
A banker told me the same words, actually. We make decisions looking forward. We are being judged looking backward. But you tell me, Akash, what are the different criteria you used when you invest private money versus public money?
No, I think one of the criteria we did when we set up our fund was to try to get a very sophisticated long-term investor base, because the idea was to try to align as much as possible the constraints and the thinking you have at a fund level with managing your own money. So again, like Ramdev, I have my own money in the fund, and we have been lucky enough to get an LP base, which is very sophisticated long-term institutions, and we have lockups in the capital we've got and stuff like that. So we've tried to, I mean, I agree with what Ramdev was saying, but I think we've tried to address that by getting a shareholder base or an LP base which thinks a lot like how I would think about investing. So that's the only way to do it. And I think, I mean, if you read about any of the great investors, Klarman, all these guys, they all say that the biggest source of edge ultimately a fund has is the LP base, right? If you have a sophisticated shareholder base who understands, it's a huge competitive advantage. And we've tried to create that in Amansa. So that's how we've tried to address this. By aligning the type of investors we have is very similar to how I think as an investor.
Well, another question I wanted to ask you, is it easier to choose stocks than to choose mutual funds?
I think...
At least you know who is the owner. In a mutual fund, the fund manager also changes. The composition of the fund changes. You take a bet, but you can't go to sleep because you don't know whether the same standards are being maintained. Isn't it more challenging to choose a mutual fund than to choose a company?
I have not gone through that process of because I have invested in my own mutual funds. But there is a gentleman, Dhruv Mehta, who was part of the study. He's a wealth manager. I mean, he's the most acclaimed, wealth advisor. I think probably you can ask, where is Dhruv? Can you take that question? Can we give the mic to him? Because it's a brilliant question and very relevant in current environment when mutual fund sahi hai. It's a huge company. And we've seen landscape of financialization and it has become very popular. It is, I mean, I'm personally very happy to be invested in mutual fund than running a direct stock portfolio. Because the pain level, performance is one, but the pain of managing a direct stock portfolio is multiple times more than the same outcome out of a mutual fund. Because you only get to see 10 paisa up or 20 paisa down. But when you're managing 20 stocks, you have to be getting in every day into the vagaries of that story, which is a lot of price to pay for managing your direct fund. But Dhruv, you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I personally think that selecting funds is more about selecting fund managers, the fund house and the fund manager. And when you select a fund, obviously you get a portfolio. So it's obviously easier to select one fund manager versus selecting, say, 20 or 25 stocks individually and monitoring it. So monitoring also becomes much easier because what you're monitoring is that the fund manager, is he following his philosophy, approach, if it's large, it's mid. Whereas if you want to assess a company, there are so many things which affect an individual company on a day-to-day basis. So it's much difficult to monitor individual stocks versus a fund. At the same time, I think what is required is that in the market you have a large number of fund offerings coming, and I think that's where people can get lost if they are not sure where they want to invest. But I think actually if you know the fund houses and you're very clear you want to do large cap or mid cap, I think it's very much simpler to identify 4 or 5 fund managers and let your money ride with them.
Thank you. Well, I think we will have to be winding up, so I want to ask more journalist questions. Akash, how is the global environment looking to you? I mean, we've had this crack on emerging market currencies and some emerging market equity markets. Do you think we are still in very rocky terrain?
You're talking about global markets?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the volatility that you're seeing now is typical of late cycle market behavior. So I mean, I'm quite cautious from a global perspective. I think 2019 for the US is going to be challenging. I don't think you get a recession, but it's going to definitely slow down as an economy. Earnings growth, you're not going to be able to repeat 25% earnings growth again. It'll be the third year in a row, which is not going to happen. And obviously the Fed is not going to stop raising rates. And I firmly believe that you are at peak utilization in the US in all aspects, peak profitability, peak lowest unemployment rate possible. It's a perfect scenario right now. That's not going to remain. And I personally think even Europe is an issue with Italy and now with Merkel going in Germany. And I think people are just conveniently ignoring the geopolitics. I mean, people have forgotten this trade spat between US and China. It's, I think, much more than just trade. It's about the US fundamentally, attacking China on intellectual property and technology and a whole bunch of things. So I think it's a very uncertain time. And I think EMs have got hit very hard. So EMs may not go down that much more from here. I frankly think that it's now time for the developed markets to take a big hit. I mean, the divergence till recently between the US and EM is unprecedented. If you look at since the post-financial crisis, the US is like this, and everything else is like this, right? So it's just a dramatic divergence. So the only good thing I could say is that I think people will gather the courage to take money out of the US now, because it's an incredible run the US has been on, and I think people in the US recognize that this is a very late stage. So I think money hopefully will come out. But before that happens, the dollar has to stabilize and other things have to happen. So I think it's going to be a choppy 6 to 9 months, personally. I think longer term EM will do better, because EM goes through cycles of 5-7 years of underperformance, outperformance. I think we should hopefully begin an outperformance cycle soon. But it's going to be a choppy 6 to 9 months, in my opinion.
Actually, today, all the PMIs that came were softer for EMs, whereas every growth indicator in US is surprising on the upside.
So that's going to reverse over time.
Okay. The other thing I wanted to ask you is foreign FPI opinion of India. I mean, they've been legging it out, 2,000 crores a day. Is it going to get worse? I mean, things like resignation of a governor or current account deficit. So is the mood very bleak? Does it get bleaker or traffic out?
No, I don't think the mood is bleak per se. I think the problem is that most people find India very expensive. I mean, it's plain and simple. I mean, the argument they say is that, look, you send them Ramdev's presentation, those last 4 charts on PEs, they say, why should I buy India now? I mean, plain and simple. So I think the problem is that, one, there is an election coming. So there is I think internationally, people are still not fully aware that that there is more risk around the elections than is perceived globally. I think you talk to people in India, you recognize that there is risk around this election. Either way, anything could happen. I think that realization is slowly coming, number one. Number two, people are frustrated with the lack of earnings growth because they've heard this story for the last 5 years and it hasn't happened. And third is just simple valuation metrics, because they look at the top 100 companies by and large, right? They don't go below that. The top 100 companies, and they want a quality filter. You look at the top 100 companies and you put a quality filter, you name me one stock which is cheap. I can't find one.
No, it's just that if you're looking at it in Jan and now, the rupee was 69, now it is 73. The index was 11,800, now it is 10,000. So relatively, at some point, it should become very attractive.
It should, Lata, but I still make the same point. I'm saying, suppose you want to invest $500 million in India, and you can only buy 5 stocks. You need to invest $100 million each in stock. Name me 2 stocks. I can't name one, so I'll just name 2. That's the problem.
All right, you spoke about elections. Ramesh, as an investor, how do you approach elections? How should investors approach elections? Entirely shut yourself from the noise or make trading bets?
I think on your channel I watched Madhav Dhar once speak, and he said that even coalition governments are fine for India. I mean, it's the whole hope of the market is that will the present government get its majority again, but he had reeled off some statistics to show that the government market did fine under various coalition government, including, you remember, the 93 Narasimha Rao government, where so many of the major economic reforms in India happened. So I say it's noise. I won't pay too much attention to it. But just to follow up on what Akash said, if you ask me one thing that keeps me up at night, it's the fact that for the last 30 years, in a very benign global environment, all right? After the Cold War, interest rates fell, trade expanded, globalization happened, the US was the sole superpower. All that is actually reversing now. And how do equity markets behave? Now we have a Russia competing for influence, China competing for influence. And in situations like this, geopolitics trumps business interests. So Trump could stop the supply chain, and because it would impact US business, but he would raise security concerns. So is there a fear in my head that the whole benign environment that we've been so lucky for the last 30 years, basically expanding trade, globalization, interest rates low, are coming to an end? I mean, it could be, and that would be worrying for me.
Oh, yes. I think we'll have to wind up on that note. But I would just, speaking about geopolitics, not that I'm an expert at all, but in the Cold War, the two major groups were not dependent on each other. Now you have the largest economy and perhaps the rival economy, China, which are deeply interdependent. So hopefully they will not do mutually destructive
Trump
policies.
is already doing it, Lata. I mean, that's what worries me. I mean, he's already doing it. He's disrupting the supply chains. And China is stealing intellectual property, according to most press reports a year. So that's not good for relationships.
And if I may add also, I think there's another problem. China has a tremendous sense of history. If you talk to anyone in China, they look at the 2,000-year civilization and they recognize that they have gone to 200 years of good times, 200 years of bad times, etc. America is unique. America has never seen decline as a country. It's never seen decline. So this is not China. China has seen it being half of the world economy to being irrelevant, to being a opium wars, to everything. They have a much broader sense of history. People don't recognize that in the US, they have never seen decline. And that's what's going on today. And they're fighting it, saying that we should not. But the problem is these are long cycles of history. It's inevitable. But if you've never seen it, and you think it's your birthright that you will always be the leading country in the world, which a lot of Americans believe, and maybe they're right, I don't know enough about it. But that is the fundamental problem. The US, if you look at this, it's all this trade wars, all tariffs, look at the crux of it. The crux of it, the US is saying that we do not want China to attain technological dominance. That we should remain the unchallenged technology power of the world. That is the crux of the fight, basically. I mean, if you boil it down, that's the problem. And China's saying we're not going to back down. What are you going to do?
Yes, I'm at the top chair and I don't want someone else there. Absolutely. Well, we do want to wind up this very interesting discussion with a very heavy heart, but let's have an icing on the cake. Mr. Bhattacharya, what would you want to add in terms of where the market is, valuations? Please, if we can reach a mic to him. So 1 minute.
I was just hoping Ramesh should provide us some more entertainment. He's the sort of encyclopedic man on quotes. So Buffett had this to say about forecasting, and Ramesh knows it better than me. I think you raised the question about analyst forecasts. He said, forecasting is tax-free entertainment. It just shows the character of the forecaster. I'm amazed Ramesh didn't mention that. And I'm amazed that media channels pay so much attention to forecasts. Huge disservice. Because no one can forecast. The other thing I wanted to, it didn't come up, but I'm very curious, is if you deconstruct future returns, then, or for that matter, returns at any point, there are three elements to returns. P multiple expansion or decline, earnings growth, dividend yields. So given where we are today, and I'm sure the audience is very interested, as they usually are, in what the future holds, I think it's pretty bleak. If Ramdev's idea that the trailing 12-month P is high, it's 1.5 sigma from average, right? The trailing 12-month P is at 21 or something, you said, 21, 22.
We're not
We're
being
not able to hear you properly, actually.
The study shows that the trailing 12-month P since 2014 has been elevated. In fact, it's a scary chart. Even in 2000, India was valued at a lower P multiple. And now for 4 years running, consistently we've been higher than that, yet everyone is a bull. Because we are investing in a story. It's amazing, the growth story, where there's no growth in earnings, but it's a growth story. Okay, so which of these is going to play out? Dividend yields in India are 1.5%, 1.6%. The P multiple is at an all-time high. And earnings growth, even if it's, let's say, amazing, let's say it's 20%. So 10% of that is going to get knocked off returns because the P multiples will mean revert. If 21 become 19.5 or 16, you've given away, the dividend yield is insignificant. So where are the returns coming from in the next few years? At least mathematically, I can't see the scope for tremendous bullishness. And then, if you add what Ramesh said, Akash said about geopolitics, bunch of other things, then it's really interesting.
So the way to go is debt funds. Thank you very much, Sanjoy, for putting that doubt in our head. Thank you.
Both on the forecasting side, which I thought Ramesh would do us the good service of pointing out what forecasting is about. But he was very diplomatic, as he always is.
Thanks.
Well, actually, we're looking at individual companies. We didn't speak a lot of macros. For that matter, we didn't even discuss whether global inflation is returning. We haven't discussed macros, but that'll require another hour. Akash, Ramdev, Ramesh, thank you very much for including me in this conversation.